Today's episode of Poets at War is sponsored by the following. Imagine countless worlds before you. Fantasy and science fiction tales. Heroes charging gallantly into battle, heedless of win or fail. Upon the ancient steps of glory, a battle for time must be won. Join the characters from every realm as they seek the words, "Well done." Audio Adventures Podcast by Joshua David Ling, full of epic poetry, sure to make your heart sing. If you like listening to Rob Inglis read The Lord of the Rings, or Andrew Peterson read his Wingfeather Saga, you'll love Audio Adventures by Joshua David Ling. Visit joshuadavidling.com/audioadventures to listen.
Today, on Poets at War, we speak with Ian Wilson once again about the essential fantasy stories and series. You are now entering the war zone. This is Poets at War.
But yeah, so that's what's been up with us. I forget what we were supposed to be talking about this evening. You want to fill me in?
Well, we were going to discuss 4 essential fantasy books. I happened to be thinking about it one day, and I was actually thinking 5, but then I thought, you know what? The way Joshua and I talk, there's no way we're going to have room for 5. So, I figure, you bring 2, I bring 2, we'll talk about them and why we think they're so important.
Right. And we're bringing like a single books or a full series.
I originally thought single books, but you were going to discuss a full book series, and so I'm kind of open to both.
Okay.
Honestly.
Well, all 4 of mine are series then, but it doesn't have to be that way. I can talk. Okay. I can talk. How about I talk specific favorite in each series?
Okay. Yeah.
Is that reasonable?
Yeah.
Sweet.
2 from me and 2 from you.
Well, why don't you, before we do that, give us an update on your stories and the way things are going? Because it's Poets at War, so we definitely want to keep up with everything we've been talking about with your Emress books and the other stuff you're working on. You and I are working on trying to get your stories out more in podcast form as well as audiobooks, which the Song of Emress is out, but I won't steal your thunder on that. You can go ahead and just tell me what's going on.
So, the Song of Emress is out on audiobook form now. Thank you, Joshua. But I think I have the link saved someplace. But anyway, and I'll need you to put that on my website at some point.
For
somewhere.
Sure. And I'll have multiple links once it gets to the other avenues. I went through Findaway Voices, so I'll recommend that to any of you all who want to put up audiobooks for sale. They do a good job at distributing to all the major platforms. So,
oh, nice, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's out there. You're working on my horror series. That's going to be in podcast form, and it's only going to be for my newsletter. You can sign up for my newsletter on my website at ianthomaswilson.com. You can sign up for my newsletter and get free updates. Everything on there is free right now, although I am looking to make it a paid subscription at some point, and the audiobooks and the podcasts will only be available through the paid subscription. So that's what's going on there. I just published the Tower of Emress, which is the 3rd volume in my series. And the way I'm planning it out right now is there will be 3 three groups of three. So the first three is A Song of Emrys, and then the Tower of Emrys, and the Sword of the Sword of Emrys, and then the Tower of Emrys, and those will be the first three. And then there'll be another three that's down the road a bit. But the Tower of Emrys is out right now. You can buy it on Amazon. It's available on paperback. I don't have it available on Kindle because I ran out of ISBN numbers. So I had to buy some new ones. So I was like, yeah, you know what? I'll put it out on paperback, and then it'll be out there, and I can buy more ISBNs and put it out on Kindle later.
Well, there you go. Sounds like you're quite the busy bee with the stories lately.
Yeah. My readers, they want more stuff, so I gotta get them more stuff.
I hear that. All right. Well, why don't you start us off with your first, unless you want to be last, in which case.
Yeah. I was figuring we'd go back and forth. I do one, then you do one, then I do one.
Well, do you want to be first or last?
I'll be first.
Okay, go for it. What's your first one?
So my first one of what I consider essential fantasy books would be the Chronicles of Narnia. Now, my favorite one in there is the Black Cauldron, which was made into a Disney movie, which I haven't seen, only because I've heard that it's not a very good interpretation of the book, and I kind of want the book to remain pure in my mind. You know what I mean?
Well, I have seen the movie. I have not read the books fully. I've read them a little bit. I got to get back into them at some point. I know they're important. But it's one of those funny things with the movie. It is simultaneously like you could see basically that you could see the potential and the love from the animators just being flushed down the toilet.
Yeah, it was bad, man.
Yeah.
From what I've heard, it was bad. As I said, I haven't seen it, and I don't plan on it. But I would consider it an essential fantasy series.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't read the whole series, at least read the Black Cauldron. Yeah. It's like the Lord of the Rings for people with short attention spans.
There you go.
It's great. It's your basic hero's journey story. A young boy doesn't know quite who he is or what he wants to do with his life. He ends up on this quest against the powers of darkness, and as the books progress, he learns a little more, and he grows a little emotionally, spiritually, and eventually by the end of the series he's fully formed character, fully integrated man, and he even becomes the king. So it's a great story. He starts out with nothing, and then he gets everything by the end.
Yep.
But he has to work for it.
Mm-hmm.
And that story is the universal story of mankind, quite frankly. Yep. Every culture in the world has something like that.
Yeah. So we could put a price on it if you want, but what would it take to get you and I to sit down to watch the Black Cauldron and comment on it? What's the price tag? What's the price tag on something like that? Because I'm going to put it out there on the podcast so that if people want to pay us to do that, like I could facilitate that.
I don't know. I was not prepared for this question there, Joshua.
I'm just seeing it, and I know the Brood would definitely be interested. Whether or not they could afford it is a whole other question. But I'm just I'm just curious. What would be your price tag on that?
I don't know. 50.
The 50 a piece. There you go.
50 a piece.
There you go. $100. Let's do it. Anyway,
yeah.
Make it so number one. But anyway, let's I guess move on to my first one.
Sure.
I'll go ahead and go with my first fantasy series that was ever introduced to me by my father growing up, reading aloud to me. And one of the major reasons that I read things aloud today, I've talked about it before, but the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis is one of the absolute greatest children's, and I would argue it is one of the greatest children's series and the best adult adult series of children's books.
Oh yes, yeah, I would totally agree.
there is no better series of books ever that was written as perfectly when it comes to the multi-generational level of children and adults. There's so much there that you miss as a child and you get as an adult. My favorite book in the series would have to be, and it kind of goes back and forth, and I usually give, unless I'm talking to someone who doesn't know about Narnia much, I would say Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's a classic. I have so much nostalgia for that story. It's such a fantastically wonderful, straightforward story in so many ways. But the more interesting answer is the one I'll give here, and the one that I think most people are far more interested in when I say it: the Silver Chair. I find the Silver Chair to be one of the most underrated stories in the entire Chronicles of Narnia. The going up into Ettinsmoor with the giants is something that is some of the most interesting world building that we do in Narnia, period, in my opinion, and it gets glossed over a lot. On top of the underground world, particularly toward the end, where it opens up and we see the true underground, and we see the salamanders and the diamonds that you can drink. Just ridiculous levels of world building there. And I find Jill Pole to be one of the most interesting characters who doesn't get talked about very much either. And I think I identify with her personally a lot, because she was handed her salvation and her role like immediately. It was one of these things where she didn't have a choice. It was immediate. She didn't like really kick against it necessarily, but it was like, what is happening? She had the glory thrust upon her in a way that I think I identify with more in their conversion to believing in Aslan, so to speak, more than any of the other characters in Narnia. And there's an album by Sarah Sparks called Into the Lantern Waste. Are you familiar with that?
I love that album.
Yeah,
That's
know that
probably
album.
one of that's like in my top 10 favorite albums, honestly. And every time I listen to it, it seems to get a little bit better.
Puddleglum's Anthem is one of my favorite things, because it's it's more from Jill's perspective, which is kind of funny, the lyrics and everything. Let me get the actual lyrics here. I can edit some of this out. Let's see. Puddleglum's Anthem. I really want to talk about this. Puddleglum's Anthem lyrics, and I won't go long on it. I just really want to make sure I get this right. Okay, so here are some of those lyrics for Puddleglum's Anthem. In the warmth of the sun I believed, circumstance often changes the way that I see. For the first time a shadow found me. I doubted the sun for the lack of the heat. I ran, but he ran after me. He said, remember the signs, so I said them each morning and held to them tight. But at the first chill of the night, I gave up his words for the warmth of fire, and I traded his love for a lie. That is, my father really connected with Eustace in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, putting up the facade, having to have your rough exterior torn off by God. And I, being, a very, in Presbyterian terms, a covenant child, the thing that I feel like I associate myself with Jill so much is this idea that you were chosen from the beginning of your life, her life in Narnia, and you've been given this task, and it's just to follow. Basically, it's just to remember and to follow, and you can't even do that, and yet he uses you still to save the Lost Prince, right? Like that's such an amazing thing. And Puddleglum's speech, and there's so many other things in that book that just get me every time, and it's so underrated.
Yeah,
So.
It's such a great. I need to read those again.
Yeah,
Quite frankly, because there's a lot of things that when you're listening to it as a kid, I didn't actually read the Chronicles of Narnia. My dad read it to me, just like your dad did. When you're hearing it as a kid, there's some things that don't quite get in there, or they worm their way in there, and you don't realize or understand it until you're fully an adult. And I think that you don't really understand the Chronicles of Narnia until you've read Mere Christianity and what's the other one? The Abolition of Man.
Yep.
Those two books. If you're not sure you understand the Chronicles of Narnia, you read those two books and you will. Because everything makes sense once you read it in the light of those.
It's true. So, not that you need to read those beforehand. You don't at all.
No, you don't.
Read Narnia, man. Like, it's C.S. Lewis's whole entire philosophy just in beautiful, incredible relief. So, go ahead with your number 2 series.
Number 2. My number 2 fantasy book is not a very well liked one. Lilith by George Mcdonald. That one, I read it last year, and I'm still dissecting pieces of it because it's such an unusual story. And a lot of people will read it and go, well, I did not understand that at all. None of that made sense. But since I've read C.S. Lewis, and I've read some of the church fathers, and I've read some of the theologians that were around in George MacDonald's day, I was reading it and going, oh, well, this makes sense. And it's a story about a young man who inherits an estate in Scotland. And he's told the estate is haunted by a ghost or a familiar spirit. And one of his ancestors had conjured the familiar spirit to help him with witchcraft or something like that. It turns out that this spirit is actually the spirit of Adam, who is taking care of the estate, and the estate is a gateway to another dimension where Adam lives with Eve, and they are the caretakers of the dead, essentially.
Interesting.
And that's where it gets kind of weird, because he's in the house of Adam and Eve, and there are these people sleeping, and he doesn't realize who they are. And it turns out that there are people who have died, who are being prepared for resurrection. And then he has to go on this quest and rescue these children, and he has to basically stop Lilith from destroying the fabric of reality.
Interesting.
I don't know how much do you want me to explain who Lilith is, or?
Well, I can give a very cursory type of thing. In Jewish mythos and folklore and some other cultures as well, Adam had a first wife that was Lilith, and she was not good for him. She was essentially, in various versions, she's either originally fallen or she actually has some other fallen nature to her that comes later. But point being that she's essentially the anti-Eve. And so there's a real at least one, possibly more, real demonic spirits that have identified themselves as Lilith. over the
Yeah.
years. And that's the other thing you have to take into account. Demons like to create their own fiction. That's something that I've noticed a lot. And so
Yeah.
there's a lot of weird stuff surrounding Lilith to begin with, and George McDonald, always got to be careful with him, but he's an interesting guy who wrote some interesting stuff, that's for sure.
Yeah. That's why I wanted to mention it, is because it is such an interesting book. It's about redemption and how God is willing to go insane lengths to save people. You know, he comes down from heaven and takes on human flesh and goes through all of this suffering to save humanity. You know, you talk to the average person who may or may not know anything about Christianity, you know, they think that was insane. That's crazy. Why would you go through all that? Because God is love.
Yep. All right. Well, and this might be to your chagrin, because I know attention span is a hard one for you, and you know exactly what's coming. In 2001, I think everybody jumped back into fantasy for a time. That's why the Narnia movies were made by Walden Media. That's why we had things like the Spiderwick Chronicles, which would have never been greenlit by Hollywood. And I actually first had any connection with Tolkien's Legendarium through the original New Line Cinema films by Peter Jackson.
Yeah.
And that was my introduction to the text. But when I actually, sat down and read The Hobbit and read The Lord of the Rings and attempted to read the Silmarillion, didn't get through it, but still have a very good grasp on it thanks to YouTube. Tolkien's Legendarium as a whole, I haven't read a lot of Christopher Tolkien's books, but I'm hoping and planning on it at some point. I find his work, and particularly in book form, particularly The Fellowship of the Ring, to be my very favorites. The Fellowship is one of those books that it's probably I hesitate to say it's the most different from the movies. There's more deleted scenes in that story than in any of the others.
Yeah.
Two Towers, like, they completely chop off like a whole ending bit when it comes to the movies. It's very, very strange where they decided to stop the story. But when it comes to like actual like stuff that's missing, Fellowship of the Ring is chock full of that stuff. And I'm getting a book soon. I haven't been able to purchase it yet, by a guy named C.R. Wiley on specifically Tom Bombadil. And I think Tom really kind of put together something that I felt when I first watched the movies, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And in the books, they really talk about it and kind of hammer it home in ways that people don't really realize. Tom Bombadil is kind of an analog through which Frodo and the others can learn about their place in the creation. And they learn about it very early on, and it helps fuel them for the rest of the story. And we know that, because not just where it's put and the structure and all the other sorts of things, but the very first thing that Frodo feels, I don't know the exact spot, but it's on his way to the Grey Havens as he's leaving. It says they get past a certain point when he's sailing, and he feels essentially the way he felt. The only time he had ever felt something like that was back in the house of Tom Bombadil. And that is such a huge thing that got glossed over in the movies through other scenes. that nobody, there's joy You hear it in Sam's speech in the Two Towers movie, which was excellent and used a lot of text from other parts of the story. But there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. And so,
Oh yeah,
that's what Tom was teaching them from the beginning, and also that good, regardless of how we see it, how we perceive it, as something sort of, bumbly and weird and happy and joyous in ways that are not exactly kingly or ways that we would normally think of it. It's like kind of dorky, kind of cherubic in some ways, but the fact is, good is the master. It's not evil. Good is master, and he always has the upper hand over evil. So, anyway, that's kind of Lord of the Rings in a little bit of a nutshell. It has a special place in my heart. It was introduced to me through the movies. And I mean, no one's going to argue against it for its actual influence on the fantasy genre, regardless of how long and everything else it is. So, but yeah. There you go.
It's long, and it's kind of hard to read for me, honestly, because it is so long, and I wish I would like to enjoy it more. It's not that I think that it was bad or anything. I just would like to sit down and actually enjoy it the way that my other friends do. I kind of feel like I'm missing something. But I do enjoy the Silmarillion quite a lot. I read the Silmarillion last year, and it was I absolutely loved it.
It is fun.
It's a fun book, very interesting. And I was watching an interview with J.R.R. Tolkien the other day, one of the few interviews he gave on television. And the reporter asked him about his principles of absolute good and absolute evil. And he said, I don't believe in absolute evil. I believe in absolute good, but I don't believe in absolute evil.
That is an interesting way to put it. I know what he's getting at because I've read enough Tolkien to know it. Enough nonfiction Tolkien. But that is just a really interesting way to put it.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it myself before, but I mean, evil, I guess the way that the people that were around in Tolkien's day thought about it, evil isn't a thing. Evil is a shadow. It's the absence of good. It doesn't really exist of itself.
It's the number 0.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good exists of itself. Evil is just the shadow of it. And that's the difference between I think Tolkien and a lot of other fantasy writers, that they tend to paint evil as being this sort of absolute thing. It's not really it isn't really a thing. It's sort of the absence of a thing.
Yes. It's a thing that's been corrupted. So, but what's your number 3?
I didn't have a number 3.
You
I didn't think we'd have time. I honestly thought, I discussed one and then you discussed one. So I didn't have one prepared. I can come up with one if you want.
But you said 4.
Yeah, 2 and 2.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
2 from me and 2 from you. I can go on if you want.
Okay. No. I mean, we can. Let me think about this a second. You meant 4 overall. How do we know we were not going to pick similar ones? I guess we didn't. Anyway,
we had discussed it, I don't know, last month sometime, and we'd come to an agreement. But I guess.
Well, when I heard 4 fantasy, and we don't have to go into it. We can save it for another time. But I will tease my other 2 that I had, simply because there are 4 fantasy series in my life, and I've talked about this before, to the audience and to you, but for those who don't know, that these 4 series have absolutely changed my life. The first times I read them, or was read them to me, or when I watched the movies. That one changed me twice, because watching it once changed me, and then reading it changed me.
What was it?
Do what?
What was it?
Lord of the Rings. Watching it, and then
Oh.
I watched it first, and then I read it, so it changed me twice.
Yeah.
But the other 2 are the Song of Albion by Stephen Lawhead, which I won't go into everything like before. But I'll save that for another time.
No. Go right into it. We got time.
Okay, all right. Here's your show now. Wink, wink, joke. I'm kidding. Dude, this is conversation, you and me. This is the way this works. You know that. But okay, so the Song of Albion, I had a yet again relationship with my dad kind of thing. All of these have a relationship to my dad. But the Song of Albion, he had the 1990s romance novel style covers version of this story.
Yeah.
So you had Clue, the main character, with these ginormous rippling pecs, and long hair and everything else on the front. Just really, really bad airbrushed 90s art. Photographic art.
See them driven before you.
Honestly, they kind of looked like Manowar covers. If you've ever seen a Manowar cover. And go ahead.
People had talked about Manowar, the metal band.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
yeah.
they looked like that.
Yes, they did. But yeah, because they were so different looking from anything else we had in the house, because my mom did not read romance. This was not something that we normally had, and he had a sword, or and the silver the silver hand, he has a silver hand on the cover, and everything. And so I'd see these books, and technically the first one he had one of the original kind of covers, which was a little bit different looking. It looked more like a fantasy novel, and I never really took notice of that one, because it looked more similar to the other stuff that we had. But then I saw the other 2, and I'd ask him about it growing up. I'd say, "What are these?" And he'd tell me and say, "Yeah, you're a little young for these. You should read them later, because they are much more R-rated than my other series."
Yeah, they're violent.
They're extremely violent, and there's some sexual assault in one of the books as well. And so it's very rough. But when I was old enough to read them, I picked them up and I read them, because during that point I was in my phase where I wanted to escape, because I didn't think the world was magical. It's funny, but Lord of the Rings initially made me long for a world that was magical, and then Albion, reading Albion helped me realize this world is magical. Albion was the catalyst that actually helped me through my greatest doubt of my faith in my life, because I had the question raised to me indirectly by some video I saw or something: why this Jewish backwater savior from this obscure corner of the world, when you are essentially, as the world and pagandom would say, you're essentially like a son of Odin, a son of Thor. You're this European, person, and what does Jesus have to do with you, right?
Yeah.
And I knew some stories about Boniface and Patrick and some of the other things, but I did not know this about Patrick, and this really kind of sealed everything up. The office of the Air Dry, the High King of Ireland, which is shown in the books in this other world kind of situation, this portal fantasy, but it's a parallel of actual what really went on in reality. This king had to be chosen not from among the actual kings of Ireland. He had to be completely blameless. No one could bring a crime against him. He could not have had a broken bone, which is extremely Jesus. He had to walk through fire. He had, like, there was all these different things that were totally the same as many of the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament, especially the earliest prophecies. And I could see from the very beginning, this is sons of Noah. Telephone gaming.
Yeah.
The prophecies.
The weird thing. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
But Irish and Welsh have a lot of very strange commonalities with Hebrew.
Yeah, they do.
Nobody can explain that. There's no explanation for it. They noticed it as far back as the 1600s, the similarities between Welsh and Hebrew.
Oh yeah. It's very, very strange. And then there's all kinds of other things. Every culture has their own connection to Jesus. Chinese have their language itself, like they're the word for a large boat, a ship, has how many people is it again? 3 sons, 3 wives, so 8 people. It has 8 people in it.
Oh wow.
Which is huge. There's, because it's kanji, they actually draw, the shape and then the dots, right? So there are 8 people in their word for ship. there's no, and they have the exact same flood myth, basically, Yeah. There's so many things that connect. It's absolutely insane with the Chinese language, which is the oldest written language on the planet. But and I say that Mandarin, more so than Cantonese, but they both had similar roots. But anyway, point being that this book turned me on to actual history and actual mythology and made me realize that all these different races of people are your dwarves and your elves who have had bad blood, and we do have true kings, and villains, and we are actually part. This brought me back to growing up on Donut Man back in the 90s. Like, I'm a part of God's army. Like, this is a real battle that we fight every day. It's not just spiritual. This is a physical, real battle that we fight. And not every battle is swords, but it's a real flesh and blood, and principalities and powers in the whole 9 yards, And we win by proclaiming the gospel. We're an army of bards going out and preaching the gospel. And so that's what Albion did for me.
Oh yeah, man.
My final one is The Wingfeather Saga by Andrew Peterson.
Oh yeah. I have not read that one.
You need to. It is excellent. The connection with my father on this one's a little bit less, because I believe read it first. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I know that he introduced me to Andrew Peterson's music first. I can remember the first song that I heard by Andrew Peterson was actually God of Our Fathers. Hilarious, right? By Andrew Peterson. And it talks about a lot of American ancestors coming over on ships and stuff, and being brought to their lands by in his words, in the bellies of the steel trains, to seek their claim in that wilderness of hope. And the book follows a family and their lost history. And it is a broken family of a mother, a grandfather, and 3 children, one of which, the youngest of which, is a girl. And I won't spoil much more than that because you haven't read it, but I will say that it had a huge impact on me, specifically in the realm of forgiveness. Not that I had a specific person to forgive or anything like that, but I realized through reading it what true forgiveness actually looks like, and how it is in many ways it's not the thing that saves everyone in the end, but it is the thing that stops the fight.
Yeah.
And that handing out forgiveness to your enemy is one of the absolute most disarming things you can possibly do. And so there's a lot of really good stuff there, and the entire last battle is one of the most tear-jerking things I've ever read. That's like right up there with the last battle. I cannot get through those chapters without bawling my eyes out.
Oh yeah.
So
that's tough.
But yeah, those were my other two that I had.
Awesome.
Oh, and favorite books in each. Really briefly, my favorite book in the Song of Albion is probably The Endless Knot, which is the final one. It gets crazy. I haven't read it in a while, but I remember it goes crazy. And then the other one in Wingfeather Saga, my favorite is it's probably The Monster in the Hollows, which is there's 4 books in that one, and it's the third book. The Monster in the Hollows is my favorite in that series. So
yeah. If I were to pick another one, it would probably be one that I read just recently, The Well at the World's End.
You've told me about this one. Yeah, tell the people about it a little bit.
It is extremely hard to read if you do not understand King James English. It is extremely difficult to read because it's all written in Shakespeare, King James English. It was written in the 1890s, but the writer, whose name just went out of my head, he had a great command of early modern English, and he wrote the entire book in that form of prose. So it's difficult to read, but it's rewarding. Because it's just like the Chronicles of Narnia.
Robert D. Sansucci? No. William Morris?
Yes, William Morris.
William Morris, there it is. Okay, there's another book called the same thing by Robert D. Sansucci. Anyway, but yeah, William Morris, gotcha.
It's kind of the same story as the Chronicles of Narnia, and you have this young man who sets out to, he's the son of the king, and he sets out to seek his fortune in the wide world, and he hears about this thing called the Well at the World's End, and anyone who drinks of it they're like the men of Numenor. They have unusually long lives. They're strong well into their old age. They're given wisdom and cheerful demeanor, basically. So he goes through all this, some of it really bad stuff, and he gets to the end of it. He finally achieves the well, and he drinks from it, and he goes back and kills all the bad people. And then his father says, "You are a better man than I, so now you get to be king. I'm stepping down." So it's a really good story if you're patient with it and you have a good command of early modern English.
Very interesting. Yeah. I was thinking, and I haven't really figured this out yet, but I think it would be really fun to do, especially with you, because this is your third time on the podcast. And even if we don't do it specifically for this one, if we did it for audio adventures or something like that, I think it would be really cool to take one of the public domain Edgar Rice Burroughs books, something like John Carter, and actually not do it as an audiobook per se, but actually do it as a roundtable read. Set up who's reading what and just see who we can get and just go through it and talk about it, every other page or something like that. I think that could be really, really fun.
That would be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
My one complaint about John Carter of Mars is that with modern audiences come modern viewpoints. Edgar Rice Burroughs was not a modern man, and he had some ideas about race that I would consider false.
Well, yeah.
And so that is my one complaint about Edgar Rice Burroughs.
Yeah, but I will say that, like, the John Carter stories are fantastic for
absolutely.
Lots of reasons. And I think that, if anything, having those conversations is going to be enjoyable for people who are level-headed like us.
Yeah.
So, but
for people that don't get offended at
every little thing.
Football mascots.
Right. Yeah, definitely. That's one of those things, man. Braves ain't changing, and I appreciate them for it.
No. And here's the thing: I watched a reporter do an interview with he was at a powwow with some actual Native Americans, like on a reservation.
Yep.
And he asked them, "What do you think of the Braves?" And they said that they didn't have a problem with them using the name because a brave
is a warrior.
Is a warrior.
Yeah.
They didn't even have a problem with the term redskin because in that tribal culture, if a man is a redskin, that means he's passionate.
It's so funny. The actual Native Americans who've, either moved back to the Southeast after the Trail of Tears, their families moved back, or the ones who are actually in question, because the Braves are very clearly and have always been very clearly, like, when they did have mascots that were Native Americans and that sort of a thing back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even back in the 50s, they were very clearly supposed to be depictions of a couple different tribes, and they actually did, way back in like the 50s, they actually did like research and talked to actual like chiefs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
In Cherokee and Muskogee and Seminole and just other different tribes around the Southeast regions, because Atlanta was the only team in the Southeast.
Yeah,
back then.
And for the record, everyone, I am part Shawnee.
Yeah, and I'm part Cherokee too. So yeah, I mean, but that whole thing, like, it's hilarious to me because the guy who they actually hired a guy for many years who's still alive as their first mascot when they moved. Actually, I think he might have even been their mascot in Milwaukee when they were in the Milwaukee Braves for a while. But he was nicknamed Chief Nakahoma. That was his nickname. But like, he was a real Native American, and like, he wasn't just hired for it. They actually like consulted with him and everything. And I know that he didn't invent it or anything because the Florida Seminoles did it first, but he and some of the players were influential in bringing the chop to Atlanta back in like the early 90s and everything, when they first started having their big runs. And like, yeah, it's a Seminole chant and that's a Florida tribe and everything, but like, it's all part of the same region. And the Braves have always been this big wide region, kind of a, they call their fans Braves country, because no matter where you go, there's Braves fans. It's not like, a really regionally specific team to begin with. So, right. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that with John Carter, the thing that I love the most about John Carter, we have a Confederate soldier who lost his battle for whatever reason, regardless of whatever your thoughts are in the Civil War and everything else.
Yeah.
He lost his mission and his home and everything. And then he found it again in the most unlikely place you can possibly imagine.
Yeah. And he brought all the races of Mars together.
Yep. He did what he could not do in the Civil War.
Yep. He brought peace between the white Martians and the red Martians and the green Martians. And they put him at the top of the heap.
Yep. Well, that's probably a good place to go ahead and wrap this one.
Yep.
This
has been a good episode.
Yeah, it has been. I'll go ahead and do a little sign off and then we can finish up our conversation. Everyone, remember, the Lord will be with you wherever you go. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Be your family's bard, and we'll see you next time in the trenches on Poets at War. God of song, said the warrior bard, though all the world betray thee, one sword at least thy right shall guard, one faithful harp shall praise thee.